got Steve Rybicki on the line. This is terrific. I am personally thrilled to have Steve from Angels Plus joining the membership meeting this evening. As I said, we're going to try something. We're going to try this as an interview format. Now, I'm sure there's many people here who've been keeping fish longer than I have. I probably kept fish for 30 years, but if you have been in Aquarius for more than 6 months, you probably kept angelfish, okay? And if you have been in Aquarius for more than 2 years, you probably bred angelfish, okay? So for me, about 20 years ago, I was breeding angelfish. I was stocking the local pet stores. And if you do that for a while, you start to know what is a good angelfish. And frankly, what I would like to call a freezer special, okay? And like many of the other breeders before me, you start to look around for a good breeding stock because you want to produce really nice fish. If you just pull any two fish together and you look at those spawns, there's a lot of stuff that should never go into a store, okay? So you want to produce really nice fish. And like many of the other breeders before me, and frankly, were after me, if you do this search, you're going to end up at Angels Plus. Okay, now, I have talked to many angelfish breeders, and I would say probably every single person who sells angelfish on Aquabit I've spoken to. And it seems like when you really get down to it, all their genetics eventually trace back to Angels Plus. Okay, so then why? Because if you really want high quality stock, right? You want something that's got shape, vigor, not something with inbreeding depression. And also if you're a breeder, you want to have accurate genetics. So, a koi is what it should be, not almost a koi. The colors are what you're supposed to be looking for. The colors in the progeny are what they're supposed to be. So, if it's a clown, okay, the progeny is supposed to be clown, so, but there's a lot of this, really inaccurate stuff in the hobby. And so again, a number of us who really care about angelfish and producing good quality angelfish, they go to Angels Plus. And if you go to Angels Plus, some of you probably have been to Angels Plus. They have a lot of nice pictures here. Steve seems to have really simplified his website, but if you actually go into the search section, you can actually find incredibly deep technical details on angelfish genetics, okay? It's really clearly written. It has the advantage of being factually correct, okay? And I don't know Steve that well, but when I read the stuff that he wrote, there's some really advanced genetic concepts in there, far beyond what you will learn, say, introductory biology in college, okay? And one of the things that I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to put onto the, into the chat, let's see, I'm going to put on the chat, if I can find that, a link to really a lot of the really detailed articles that Steve has written. Really, they're not long, they're very clear on all aspects of angelfish because we're not going to have enough time to go through all of those. Now, so about 20 years ago, I was on a trip to Buffalo. I took time to visit Steve in Orleans, New York, in Western New York. I met the guy, visited his warehouse. We've been friends ever since, but despite our friendship, I can tell you it's been impossible to get Steve to go to a club meeting. I've tried many times, but his business is angelfish. The shipping season is limited. It doesn't make any sense for him to go and do club stuff. So I'm really thrilled that we have this opportunity that we can have Steve join us in a virtual format, okay? So, and then rather than giving a presentation, Steve has agreed to an interview format. I have a few questions prepared, but I would expect that you will ask questions. You can do this via chat, or at some point, we'll turn the mute off. You can go ahead, depending on how many people we have. We have right now 77 in so far, and we have a few more in the waiting room. And Clark and I will actually take turns asking some of these questions and facilitate the chat. If you choose to ask questions by the chat, just so you know that if you ask a question of general interest, we will address that immediately. If you have a very specific question, we may do that to the end, okay? So Steve, you ready?
Sure, I'm ready. Appreciate it. Thanks very much, Willie. Thanks for the kind words, and it's good to be with everybody.
All right,
so
terrific.
You can go ahead and ask whatever you feel like asking.
All right, I'm going to start off with a few questions, but again, put it in the chat, and if you have stuff that you ask, we can stop our questions. So most people, I know that when they do interviews, they do it chronologically, but I'm actually going to jump right to the end. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a question that most angelfish nuts are completely obsessed with. Okay, which is, Steve, how did you create the most orange koi angelfish in the world?
Well, it's really hard to say because it's a process that kind of evolves as it goes on. I mean, when I was quite young, every angelfish was pretty, plain brown, gray, stripes, marbled, black. There weren't really colors on angelfish. And it was sometime in the late 70s when I ran into some fish that were a little bit different. They were actually, at the time, I didn't know, but they were gold blushing, and they had a little orange spot on their head. And I had already gotten a hold of some gold marbles that had some reasonably nice, color on them. And it was kind of purely by accident that I crossed these gold blushing into the gold marbles, and within 2 generations, I had what we were calling gold marble blushing, which later, probably about 8 or 10 years later, was named by another angelfish breeder, koi, and it stuck. So, so my process was simply getting stock, seeing that there was color on it, and then through natural curiosity, just basically seeing, can I make the color better? Can I selectively breed and increase intensity or increase coverage and that kind of thing? And ironically, at the same time, there was another breeder in my small town, only and has 15,000 people, and it's a very small town, but it had an active fish club, and there was probably 15 or 20 people in town that had fish rooms, which is amazing when you consider the size of the town. And one of the guys, Dave Lasnik, had an angelfish room and a guppy room, and he just happened around the same time, bought some fish from a lady in California that was selling these. They were basically the same kind of fish, some kind of a gold blushing angelfish. I cannot remember what you called them, but Dave, I'm sure, could tell you, but it was something like red-capped, angelfish or something like that. And at the same time, he happened to start his own line of koi in the same city without me knowing about it, because I didn't meet him until about 1983, 82, 83. And at that time, we had both gotten our separate line of gold marble blushing going at the same time. And once we got to know each other, we started selling angelfish together wholesale, and we started cooperating, trading breeding stock, stuff like that. And between the two of us, we managed to selectively breed angelfish so that, they got more color on them. It was very, very painfully slow process. Probably took 10 years for the process for the fish to go from a little dime-sized patch of orange on its head to something that was maybe 2 inches long on its crown. And over the years, it just simply progressed in increments. Like you might go 4 or 5 years and nothing really looked better, and you all of a sudden you make the right cross and you've got something significantly better, 1 or 2 fish, and then you keep those as your primary breeding stock and you go from there. And so, it just kind of evolved as time went on. We got more color. We wanted to be more reddish rather than orangish, although really orange is the predominant color. And, we also wanted as much coverage on the body as we could get. We found out a few things. We found out that it was very environmentally influenced. If you didn't take really good care of them, the color wouldn't express. If you stressed them in any way, good color might fade. Intensity of color had an awful lot to do with a lot of factors other than just care. It was also what your water was like. Like if you were unlucky and had some water that had some mineral dissolved in it that they didn't like, then you might not get much color. And if you had the best water in the world without even knowing it, you could have some really colorful fish. And then there's genetics involved also. And in my own personal belief, I think epigenetics is the main process by which the orange gets greater and greater and then continues from generation to generation to getting better and better. And I think if you just let them interbreed naturally without the selective process, eventually they'll revert back to very little color. So that's why selective breeding of the best colored fish to the best colored fish is so important, because that's how epigenetics works. It's an environmentally triggered gene, and it doesn't turn on unless the environment is exactly what you want. And you have to select for fish that are expressing that the best. So that was kind of the process over the years. And it's basically been, 40, it's going, it's a 40-year process so far. So, 40 plus years, maybe 44 years, something like that. So it's been a long haul to get to the point where it was a barely orange fish to one that's, pretty intensely colored with a lot of coverage. So basic process.
Steve, there was a question in the chat where somebody's asking, do you think the pearl gene is related to a less than ideal body shape in angels? But maybe you could also take that question and expand it a little bit, in that when you're working with, these crosses over and over again, are there things that begin to pop out, and how do you maybe control for those? Things that are less ideal, they pop out, and how do you try to control for those?
Okay. Well, first on the pearl and the body shape, or the less than ideal fish, what you will get is that when a mutation occurs, and somebody's got this brand new fish, and it's the only one in the world, well, it occurs maybe on some poor stock.
Steve, can you hear us?
Yeah, you hit the mute button, Steve.
Actually, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. I think you accidentally hit the mute button.
I don't have a mute button.
Oh.
I'm not sure how I
you
would
might
have
have.
hit it, but I
Go
got a
ahead.
message that said hit *6 to unmute. So I don't know how it ended up getting muted. Maybe it's got some kind of automatic mute on it or something. But
Well,
anyway,
good.
sorry about
Thank
that.
you.
And I'm not sure what you heard so far, but I was talking about mutations and how they can occur on poor stock. And so if you have a pearl scale that occurs on a poor angelfish, then that's the stock you're working with. And so it might appear as if pearl scale is causing a poor body shape, and then it's not actually doing that.
Help with.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. Somebody, Dan, you need to mute your mic.
I muted it.
Thanks, Kurt.
Oh, all right. So like when pearl scale was first developed, it occurred on a fish that had a genetic problem. They tended to not have ventral fins. Anybody who they came in the early 90s, about 1990, 91. Anybody who can remember back to that time frame will recall that most pearl scales were missing ventral fins on part of the spawn or most of the spawn, and it was a struggle. What we had to do was outcross them to some good fish, and then continually, it was a recessive mutation, so we had to continually outcross to get rid of these missing ventral fins on these fish. But as far as body shape goes, you could get, it's like if somebody made an outcross to pearl to get it onto a different color variety, they could choose a poor fish to do it, and you'd end up with poorly shaped fish. And at first, when they first came in, that's what people were doing. They were outcrossing to everything so they could try to get the pearl trait onto many different strains. And if you didn't if you weren't careful, if you just let anything breed with anything, you could end up with some really crummy fish. And that's part of the reason why there's so many crummy fish on the market. People are not selective in their pairings. They just let whatever mates with whatever it mates with, and they keep the fry, and they keep them no matter how ugly, long-bodied, they just don't seem to care. And part of that's because they're beginners who don't know what to look for, and part of it's just because they think that's how you're supposed to do it. Let the mate choose the other mate, and whatever it is, that's what you go with. But that's not how it works. With me, I always select the male I want to go with the female, and I always make sure that their ideal fish, in my eyes, are pretty close to it, so that I can try to improve the line while I'm putting genes from one line to another line. So anyway, pearl scale it has had problems in the past, but the gene itself does not cause poor fish, as far as I can tell. Pearling is inhibited under poor care. So like if you raise a bunch of pearls up and you crowd them and you don't change water and you don't feed them well, then the pearl may not even develop on them, even though they are pearls. And so the best pearling comes with the best care. And that's true of a lot of traits with angelfish. So something to keep in mind.
Okay, Steve. So I was afraid this would happen. We're actually getting a lot of questions. So we're gonna have to. Okay, so we'll get as many as we can, but keep sending us the questions on chat. I'll take the next one. Clark and I tag team on this one. So I want to bring us back. So you were talking about in Orleans how, you're one of the few people I know who has, like, your entire career, everything is really just one business, and you started it from scratch. Can you, and I'm sure that this is a bit of a dream for a number of the people on this call. Can you tell us a bit about how you got started?
Well, for me, it was pretty simple. I had a fish room, which was, I'm not going back to the very beginning when I was a kid and had, tanks all over my bedroom, because, I started like everybody else does, only I was addicted to it for some reason. But anyway, as I got older and I bought a house, I got married, bought a house. The first thing I did in that house was I built a fish room. I had 60, 70 tanks in that fish room, and I had lots of fish, lots of things. Eventually you get to the point where, what do you do with all these fish? And I was selling some to pet shops, but most pet shops wanted to trade you for food or something like that. And I had way too many fish. I didn't need the food. I needed the money to buy the things I needed for the fish room, not just food. And so at the time I stuck an ad in, I don't know if you remember FAMA magazine, Freshwater and Marine Aquarium magazine.
Yep.
Magazines were very popular back then because there was no internet. Everybody had, you subscribed to 2 or 3 different fish magazines, and in the back of those magazines was a classified ad section. And I put ads in those classified ad sections. And at first I did it just to see if I could get rid of some things I had, extra heaters and pumps and stuff laying around. And then I advertised that I had some fish, and the response was amazing. I mean, I couldn't believe it. So it just clicked that, hey, there's a market out there for fish. And so I started putting ads in for the fish that I had, and they sold very well. And it got to the point where I printed out catalogs and mailed catalogs to people because it was worth doing, because I had that many people looking to get fish. And eventually I looked at it, and I looked at my wife and said, I want to quit my job. So, and our second child was on the way at the time, and she said, go ahead. So, I mean, that was a miracle that I had a wife who would let me do that at that time of my life. And so I did. I quit my job. I went full bore into it, bought a building, put a 300 tank hatchery in it, did all kinds of crazy things, and lo and behold, that room that I put the tanks in, we drilled a well, and turned out the water wasn't any good. So I wasted like 2 years of time on a building that had very bad water. It couldn't raise anything properly, and ended up having to close it down, tear it apart. And then I bought another building, put in another well, and this one worked. So it just went from there. I've built many fish rooms over the years, and large ones too. So anyway, that's how I got into it. I just kind of just fell into it.
Okay, Steve. So before Clark jumps in with the follow-up questions, just want to ask you about one aspect of this. So I mean, you use the term epigenetics. Okay, I suspect if we were to ask four-year biology majors, if we were to ask four-year biology majors to write a definition for epigenetics, none of them could do so. How did you learn so much about genetics?
Well, for me, it was just simply a necessary thing to understand what was going on in my fish room. I mean, you don't need genetics to breed good angelfish. I mean, people have been selectively breeding animals of all kinds for centuries without any knowledge of genetics and producing unbelievable animals. You don't need it for that. But if you want to try to understand what's going on so that you can try different techniques and maybe, if you're going to make an adjustment you think is going to work for a reason. And so I subscribed to genetic art, magazines. I had genetic textbooks. I had, I listened to genetic podcasts. I did what, any curious person would do when they were interested in the subject. You just start reading about it, listening to it, and trying to figure it out. And in a lot of cases, I'm guessing because, with genetics, you don't really know what's going on. And in my opinion, I think epigenetics is the best explanation as to what's happening with color on koi angelfish and a few other things. As I've learned more and more about genetics, I have learned that it's not just the genes you have, it's the environment that triggers the activation of those genes. A lot of genes lay dormant and have no expression until the environment makes it do something differently. I'll give you an example. Albino dantum angelfish is relatively new to the hobby. They came in, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And the albino gene in the dantums is a different albino gene that was in the hobby before that. So there's two different albino genes on different locations, different gene locations, and they work in different methods of removing melanin. And the first one that came around in the late 90s. It's a classic albino, works really well. It takes all the melanin out of the fish, and unless you have a double dark, then you'll see a little dusty color still left on the fish, and occasionally on a dark marble, you'll see a little black marbling still stuck on the fish somewhere. But pretty much all the fry would be albino, and they grow up with pink eyes and all this stuff. Well, the Dantum albino was a different fish, and I recognized it the first time I saw it. I looked at the fry, and they weren't white, clear-eyed fish. They were light gray with a dusky eye, and I thought, this is weird. These adults look like regular albinos, but these fry from them did not look like it. And so I suspected they were different. And when they were grown up, there was a couple breeders who proved by crossing them to each other that they were different genes on different locations. But what I discovered was that if I put this, so here we have this gene on another location that causes albino, but it doesn't cause albino under all conditions. So if I have a tank that's too dark, too cold, too something for that gene does not express, and the fish looks like a normal, regular silver angelfish. And that's, when I first discovered this, I made a post on an angelfish forum, and everybody said, nah, you're wrong. Somebody sold you the wrong fish, and, you got suckered. You thought it was albino. It's not. And I couldn't convince them that I knew what I was talking about, that I had seen the fish, that they were albino, and that they reverted back to silver. So I documented it. I put it on my website. And I now found out that I can take these fish, even as adults, and I can put them in a certain condition in a certain tank, and they'll turn back into looking like silver angelfish. And then if I put them under the conditions that helps that gene trigger, they go back to reverting to albino, pink eye, pink pupil on the eye, total melanin's wiped off the fish. It takes months for that process to happen. but I can do it at will by manipulating the environment. So that's how epigenetics works. It's an environmentally triggered gene. And with the orange on koi angelfish, I'm convinced, you see what angelfish don't produce yellows, oranges, or reds. They take it from their food and they store it in their skin. So they take these carotenoids, they store it in their skin. They store it in their skin only if their immune system isn't using it. So they have to be under great conditions for that to happen. But what happens is, at least what I believe is happening, is that if you give them these really great conditions for them to store that, there's an epigenetic marker that goes on the gene that tells that gene, okay, store these carotenoids whenever you see them. And the color becomes better and better and better. And it lasts for about 3 or 4 generations. So the more you select for genes that are expressing this marker, the more markers you'll have and the more orange you'll get. But as soon as you stop selecting for it, or you put them in poor environment, the color reverts. And if you just let anything breed to anything and you keep them crowded in poor conditions and don't change water and feed them too much and all this kind of stuff, eventually you'll be right back to where I started 45 years ago. You'll have white fish with almost no orange or just a tiny little bit on it. So it's not a matter of, okay, I've got this gene for orange and no matter what I do, I get an orange fish. It doesn't work that way. You get orange fish through tremendously good care and preserving the epigenetic marker that's put on each gene, each gene that's involved in that. I'm not sure how many genes are involved because it's not something we can test for. It's just something we can guess at. And so that's kind of the process by which I came to the conclusion that I think it's an epigenetic marker, but I've actually kind of proven it with the Dantum albinos because I can change it just by changing the environment anytime I want. So there's definitely epigenetics involved on the expression of patterns and colors. Same thing happens with half-black angelfish. The half-black pattern does not develop under some conditions. Under the right conditions, it develops. That's an epigenetic expression. So that's kind of a layman's way of explaining epigenetics.
So Steve, I want to go back to when you were talking about dantums in general. What as I said, what was attracting me personally to your fish, and I suspect many other breeders, is really the sort of exceptional shape and vigor, as well as the accurate genetics. But so I think for a lot of the people who are into angelfish, what really strikes us about Angels Plus angelfish has been your wild crossing programs to really recover the shape and the vigor, the demeanor of the fish, in some cases the fertility. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. When I first started breeding angelfish kind of heavily back in the late 70s, I was really disappointed with the quality of the angelfish. They were long-bodied. The males would tend to have giant humps on their head. They looked like flower horns. I mean, they were just. I found them very ugly. Fins would be curled and bent and pointed back, and it just was not what I called attractive compared to a wild angelfish. A wild angelfish, it comes out of the wild and it's just perfect. And so I thought, well, how do we get these things back? Can I breed them to wild? And I didn't even know if I could breed a wild. I mean, I had no idea. And what happened was I brought in some wilds and I found out over time that they would interbreed, and they would interbreed, I didn't need special water. My water has never been very good, except occasionally. I've had different rooms. In one room, I had some pretty decent water. But a lot of times I was dealing with 8.5 pH and 4, 5, even 600 parts per million hardness. It was nothing that anyone would have ever said you could breed a wild angelfish in, but I found out I could, and I did frequently. And I could get them to cross with the domestics, but it wasn't easy. I pretty much had to take, a male angelfish and put it in with 5 domestic females and hope that one of those females would eventually get him to spawn with them. Sometimes it took a year, sometimes it took 2 years to get one male to spawn with one female. But after I got that first spawn, that first generation, it got easier. It got easier each generation. And so I could use wild fish to get rid of some of the flaws that had been bred into fish by indiscriminate breedings with domestic lines. And so I ended up with I would still selectively breed, and I would selectively breed towards wild shapes, wild fin types. And I would cross veil into it and try to just get the nicest veils I could out of that wild shape. And I was very attracted to the Dantum, especially because the Dantum angelfish almost has an Altum-like look to it. Nobody really knows where or how it was developed. I mean, the person who named it kind of named it as a combination of his name and the word Altum, which is a different species. And so he called them Dantum, and they actually do look a bit Altum-like. They have wider stripes. They have a steeper predorsal profile. They have a lot of things that do remind you of an Altum. Now, how they were developed and what they are, I can't tell you. But I do know that I can cross them to my domestics, and that a lot of the shape to them seems to be from dominant type genes. And I can create, within 2 generations, I can get back to a very Dantum-like shape on another fish, another variety. You know, like my latest project was to get Dantum into koi. And I have some koi now that have good color, and they have a Dantum shape because they're F2s out of Dantums. And so I'm trying to pass that gene around. I did the same thing with the Nene River fish, which are very nice wild angelfish. And I've seen others do it with Santa Isabella fish. There's Manicapurus. There's lots of different varieties of wild angelfish that have traits that are very interesting. And you can put those traits into domestics if you selectively breed and you go for several generations. The thing about it is, this isn't for the faint of heart hobbyist who's just passively keeping angelfish. It takes a decade to get through this to the point where you've done several generations, and you're using wild fish. So it's not like, when they're 6 months old, you automatically have a spawn. It might take you a couple years to get the very first spawn. So it's a long-term project, but it's worth it. I always looked at it like, well, if I wait 10 years before I started, I'll be 10 years behind. I might as well just start now, and we'll see what happens. And 50 years goes by in a heartbeat. So let me tell you, it doesn't take long. And so you might as well start those projects early if you're really into it, and you'll end up with something down the road that made it worthwhile. And that's the way I look at wild angelfish crossing. They improve the domestic lines. I can still keep all the domestic mutations we like, whether it be pearl scale or blushing or some blue coloring, your blue iridescence, or the orange pigments from the koi, or whatever it is I want to keep. I can keep it and put it onto a wild shaped fish that has what I consider better behavior. They're a little more flighty. They swim faster. They have more wild type characteristics, but I like those. And so that's what I select for. And I've been pretty successful in doing that. But what happens is, after 8 or 10, 12 years of a line, you got to do it again. You got to start over. You got to take that line. You got to go back into wild again, because they fall apart. There's too many genes in there from too many domestic fish that they're recessive. They hang out. Eventually they pop back out. Your line starts going down a little bit. You've got to make that fresh cross again, or your line just gets worse and worse each generation. And that's what I try to convince people of, is indiscriminate breeding is what's bad for angelfish if you really care about how they look. And I encourage people to be very selective on how they do it and to use wild stock. And there's quite a few people doing it now. I mean, back when I did it, Dave Lasnik was doing it with me at the same time, and he had the first cross. And I'm positive there was no one else in the world doing it at that time. I mean, I was very connected in the angelfish world, and I never heard of anybody even keeping wild fish back then. They didn't care about them. They only cared about the domestics. Well, we kept them, and we crossed them, and we encouraged other people to do it. Now there's people all over the place doing it. So, the top breeders, there's lots of top breeders doing it. So I think it's a good thing for the hobby, and I encourage anybody who has an opportunity to do it and the time to do it, because they'll be very happy with what's produced from them.
Steve, when you think about uh, bre- uh, an active breeding pair, how long can you really, how many years will they keep breeding? And, or maybe you don't let the same pair breed over and over again. And then kind of a follow-up is, how does water temperature affect that as part of the process?
Well, they're very integral. Water temperature is very integral to the process because this is a cold-blooded animal, and lifespans on cold-blooded animals are controlled by temperature. So, like if you take an angelfish pair and you breed it as often as you can at 83 degrees or something like that, it might lay eggs every 7 days, and it might lay 40 spawns in a row. I mean, you'll be amazed at what you can get, and it will burn out and it will run out of eggs. The female will quit spawning and they'll die young. They'll, they might breed 2-3 years max, maybe less, and they're old already because they've been kept hot, and they'll probably die not too long after they quit breeding. Now, on the other hand, now I don't keep breeding pairs very long, except for wild pairs. When I have a wild to a wild pair, the only reason I own that fish is so I can produce offspring that can be used for my outcrossing program. So I have wild pairs that I've kept until they were 10 years old, and they were spawning until they were 10 years old because they were kept lower temperature. I could keep them months at a time at 70, 72 degrees, and they would be fine. Angelfish don't do poorly at low temperatures. They do poorly when they're overfed. And people don't realize that at 70 degrees, they need about 1/5 the amount of food they need at 80 degrees. So they overfeed them. And when you overfeed anything, you kill it. And then, so they kill it because it's at 70 degrees and they blame it on the temperature. Well, it's not the temperature. They killed it because they overfed it. I've kept fish for a decade at 70 degrees and they're fine. I've had them breed in the 60s. I've had spawns at 67, 68 degrees. So they're fine if you take proper care of them at that temperature. Water changes, the right amount of food, which is very little. But then I can take that fish, so say 4 years from now, and I want to get another spawn to cross into things, and I've still got an F0, a wild pair caught in the wild, and I can use that pair to get fresh DNA to put into my domestic strains 8-10 years down the road. So I've experimented purposely with temperature to keep these pairs alive and breeding for a long time because I do not want to turn generations over on wild fish. I want to turn generations over on domestic fish I'm trying to improve. Those, I want a new generation every 7 months because that's how I improve them, by rapidly turning over generations, selectively breeding for what I want. Wild fish, it's the reverse. So I've done both. And I tend to err on keeping my fish tanks in the 70s because I think at 80 degrees and above, they spawn too frequently, they burn out too quickly, and who really needs 25 spawns in a row of 500 baby fish from a pair of one? Nobody. I have 400 tanks, and I don't ever want that number of fish. Even if you're a wholesaler and you're trying to produce them by the thousands, generally you want large numbers of varieties, one spawn off of each pair every 3-4 weeks or something like that. And if you've got 10 pair, that's still 5,000 fish a month. I mean, you don't really need a pair to be producing that fast. And higher temperatures cause a lot of other problems. It means there's less oxygen in the water. It means that they're going to be more aggressive because those temperatures make everything's sped up on the fish. You'll get more fighting, and they need more space because there's less oxygen in the water, and food, any food that goes in that water pollutes quicker because the metabolism on the fish is higher and faster. So all around, very few hobbyists need a fish at 80 degrees. I've never seen anybody who needs it at 80 degrees, but they all keep it there or above. I mean, I know people keeping angelfish at 85, 86, 87, just like they do discus. And once again, I don't think it's good for the fish. I think it's actually harmful. And if you were to practice more of the 75, 76 degree range, you'd get fewer spawns. They'd live a lot longer, and you would have you could keep more fish in a tank without problems. You'd use less food. There's so many advantages. I can't even list them all. You just have way better fish if you keep them a little cooler. So that is how I do it.
Okay, that's quite a learning, Steve. So one of the follow-up questions we had was, why is breeding koi angels seem much more difficult than breeding other strains?
When you say difficult, do you mean like getting them to spawn and lay eggs?
I think that was what the question is. Dario, did you want to unmute and explain that question a little more? Dario said in the chat, raising fry.
Yeah, I think, I can
it's
jump in there. Yeah, I think
Sure.
getting the amount of spawn sizes compared to other strains, you get very few. It seems like they're way more touchy with the growing them out.
Well, here's one thing you have with koi angelfish that's a little bit unique. Because of the genetics of the fish, you kind of have to line breed them. If you outcross a koi angelfish, you lose color. So every time I outcross a koi angelfish, I'm outcrossing it to a wild fish, and it takes me a year and a half to get color back on that line. So you don't do it that often because you're basically going a year and a half without the same quality of the color that you want. So they're more inbred. And an inbred fish, you have to be far more selective. Like when I set up koi pairs, I might set up 30 or 40 pairs, and I'm only going to keep maybe 1 or 2 of them. That's all I'm going to keep out of 30 or 40 pairs. And it's not always because of the spawn size, but there's many things that go into play. Like I'm not selecting for color. I'm selecting for body shape, fin shape, spawn, not only spawn size, but the size of the fry, the size of the wigglers, how vigorous the wigglers are. That stuff is more important to me than the color. Color is almost last on the list. So I'll set up 30 or 40 pairs that all have good color, but I don't keep the best colored fish. I keep the fish that throw me the best fry, the most frequent best fry. I mean, that's really the only way you can do it and do it long term. So what happens is when you buy a line of fish that's inbred, like half blacks, everybody inbreeds those, or albinos or koi, you even double dark blacks, you tend to get fish that they're in need of an outcross that people aren't doing. And so you have to be very selective on the pairs, and you need a lot of pairs to get that one good one, to get a really good one. And so it's better, to have a lot of, to do that outcross, have a lot of space for pairs. Like I have a lot of tanks and I don't sell a lot of fry. It's because I have 200 tanks that have nothing but adult koi angelfish in them because I'm selecting from a very large number so that I can get that needle in the haystack, that one of a kind pair that's got everything going for it. You just don't get that with, getting 6 fish and getting 1 pair out of them. And, your chances of that being that one super pair is about 1 in 1,000. I mean, it's just such a low odds, but that's how most people do it. So if it's just a random pair, then your chances are kind of poor of getting something that's really good. The other thing is inbred fish need better conditions. They need better food. They need better water. They need better care, more water changes. They might need more live food or frozen food or higher quality food. And so you can get the results, but a lot of times it just takes a little bit more work to get the results. So that could be what, you're up against.
One of the other questions in the chat was about color varieties. Do you see some color varieties coming up in the future, or are there color varieties people are working on or you're working on?
Well, the thing with angelfish is that, there's quite a few color genes. I'm not sure how many, there's new genes all the time. There's a gene for blue, and there's one for green, and then you've got your stripeless genes and your pearl scale genes, and then you've got your couple different kinds of marbles and blacks, and you've got a streaked gene, and you've got just smoky and gold marble and gold, and keep going down the line, and you take these genes and you can combine them in almost any combination you want. And if you combine a fish that's got 12 different genes in it, I mean, how many people are producing that fish? Probably nobody. So there's probably the potential of several hundred different varieties of angelfish just using the genetics that we have right now. Some of them will look so similar you won't even know that they're slightly different. Some of them will look radically different. But it's easy to work. It's easy for any hobbyist to work on a combination that almost nobody else is doing, or maybe nobody else is doing, if you want to take the effort to do that. What I find is that most people gravitate to a few colors that are nice, bright colors or patterns that are very distinct. People seem to really like the color orange and the color blue, although the blue isn't really a pigment. The blue is an iridescent. It's a shiny iridescent pigment called guanine. It's a waste product that the fish stores in its scales. And if you're at a different angle or different kind of light, it's just silvery looking, and sometimes it looks blue or green or purple or whatever. But that's because it's not a pigment; it's refracted light. So depending on the light on the tank, you get these different colors. But anyway, you take those colors or a pattern that's unique, like the seal points, which are created from that Bulgarian green gene. So seal points, half blacks. Anything that's unique and isn't common is popular. But you could add pearl scale to that. You can add blushing to it. You can add albino to it. You can do so many things to come up with something a little bit unique. That if that's really what your goal is, you can definitely figure out, something to make that literally nobody else is working on. Myself, I used to try to do everything, but as more and more genes hit the market, it became impossible. So I actually got rid of fish, and I only work on a few things. I work on difficult fish. I want fish that other people can't easily reproduce, which is why I choose koi and albinos and wilds and double darks, because they're difficult fish and other people have trouble with them. And so I like the challenge of difficult fish, and I can produce fish that other people can't produce, and it gives me a market. So I like that. Other people are going to want an easier fish depending on their level of experience. So they're going to choose something that doesn't give them all the difficulties, the ones I just mentioned to you, But that's a personal choice. I mean, people have a very wide range of things they can choose and be successful with. It's just up to them to figure out what floats their boat, what they like to do.
Speaking of particular colors, somebody asked that blue is a popular color. Do you think the Philippine blue gene has been established to a high quality standard?
It's a very strange gene, because you'll see a lot of fish on the internet that are extremely colorful, but they're fake. It's so easy to doctor these pictures. So the biggest thing that some people do is they shine a blue light on the fish, and it just looks brilliantly blue. They're not. There's a fish being sold overseas called Avatar. It's a blue fish they named Avatar. I know some people, that have purchased this fish, and it's just a plain regular old blue fish, just like any other blue fish. And so they're being scammed. Internet pictures are something to be very cautious about. They are so easy to misrepresent a fish with a photograph. I can't even explain to you how easy it is. It's simple for people who know photography, and it's done all the time. Blue angelfish are pretty fish, but they do not look blue at all angles under all light. They look really good under the right light at the right angle for a flash of an instant. But when they turn and they go to the back or to the dark, they don't look like a koi. I have koi in a dark tank, and I can see them they're orange. It doesn't matter. I can see the orange. blue, you can't. It requires light to be reflected off of the shiny scale at the right angle and the right kind of light. And if you shine a blue light on that fish, it's going to, or a black light or I don't even know what kind of lights are shining on them, but you can greatly exaggerate it. Just like you can take a koi angelfish and you can shine an infrared light on it or a red light on it, and it's going to exaggerate the color fivefold or what it actually really looks like. So internet colors are something to be very cautious about. Trust me, you buy fish from 20 different breeders and 15 of them you're probably going to find are not the same color as what the pictures you saw on the internet were. So, buyer beware. But as far as blues go, as far as like selectively breeding for them, I haven't done that very much because I was never that attracted to that fish. I had them in my tank and I just wasn't that impressed with them because they, like I say, if you don't have them at the right angle, they just look like, regular fish. And so I didn't work on it that much. I am certain that someone could improve upon them. But since it is a reflected light, not a pigment, they can only improve to the point where under the right light at the right angle, it'll look like a better blue. So how long that might take, I don't know. They're an easy fish. Every single fish you create out of them will have blue on them. You don't have to worry about selectively. Like koi, you could have a range of fish from no orange at all the way up to all orange and everything in between. But with blues, it's not going to work that way. They're all going to be blue, and they're all going to be a certain amount of blue. And there might be a few that have a little bit more, and those are the ones you'd have to select for. But they're easy to do, so it's like part of the reason I'm not attracted to them is because they're easy to do. So whether you could turn it into a very blue fish, hard to say. I've yet to see anybody do it though, where you knew it was significantly better. The ones that I'm seeing that are looking really good on the internet are fake, they're fake photos, doctored photos.
When you think about, I was just gonna ask a little bit more of a basic question for somebody who, you've got a lot of breeding pairs. What are you feeding those breeding pairs in order to get, keep them and get them in the best shape possible?
That's a good question. A lot of people have very, very, very different opinions on food and quality and stuff like that. And I don't have any science to back any of this up. I just go by what has worked for me for a long, long time. And the thing that I feed the most of all foods, and I've tried everything. I've fed live blackworms. I've fed frozen bloodworms. I've fed freeze-dried tubifex and freeze-dried everything under the planet. And I
Take
feed
a look at this
frozen.
angelfish.
I feed frozen brine shrimp for a majority of the food that they get. And now I hear people on the internet saying, frozen brine shrimp, low quality food, no nutrition, don't give it to your fish. Well, those people are clueless. They don't know anything because it is an unbelievably good food. Produces incredible spawn sizes, vigorous fry, throws color on the fish. It's an amazing food. And so I feed a lot of it. I also do feed other foods out of convenience. Like I feed pelleted food and flake foods and prepared, processed foods because they're convenient, not because they're better. Although if you want to add a little carotenoids to your fish, like you want carotenoids for your orange fish, then you have to have something that has some color enhancer in it. Although shrimp and bloodworms and krill and plankton, they all have carotenoids in them and they all add to the color of orange fish. But some of the prepared foods, they put extra of that stuff in there. And so it adds a little more color. So, you're going to obviously pick some kind of a color food to feed your koi angelfish, at least occasionally. But it's not what I feed them all the time. I feed them mostly frozen brine shrimp, along with all of my other pairs, including my wild fish and literally every fish I keep, because I keep other fish. I have live bears and bristlenose and catfish and stuff like that too. And everything gets frozen brine shrimp. They just all do so well on it. So that's my preference for feeding. Other people will feed other things. And there's nothing that grows an angelfish any better than like, live blackworms. It's just that it's very easy to overfeed them, even kill the fish from the food. It tends to be high in bacteria levels, so they get infections easy and bloat, and it also has a parasite load that they carry. And so your fish can be infected with parasites, and then you have to treat for that, and that can be a nightmare. And for a while, I was being sponsored by a blackworm company, and they were sending me like 5 pounds of blackworms every week, and I was feeding them to my fish, and they did amazingly well on it. And I killed a lot of fish with them, and I also had to treat my whole hatchery with, medication to get rid of parasites for a couple months after I quit doing it. I don't ever feed that stuff now. The only thing I will feed now is a food that cannot carry parasites, and freeze-dried foods. That process will kill parasite eggs, so it can't be transferred. Frozen foods, the only one I trust is frozen brine, because most of the others are freshwater foods, and I don't trust those. The frozen brine shrimp comes from a heavily saltwater lake, and so the freshwater parasites don't live in that lake. There's not even fish in the lake, as far as I know. It's the Great Salt Lake, so there's no chance of infecting my fish with it. And so that's the biggest reason I like it, because it's quality and there's no parasites.
So Steve, you've talked about, I think, so food, I think that's really important. You talk about temperature. And so what are other things? What are some of the mistakes that you do see people make when they raise and breed angelfish?
Well, one of the things I think people really get confused with is the aggression of angelfish. I see a lot of people on the internet giving the advice that every adult angelfish should have, 35 gallons of water or something to that effect. And what they don't understand, is that angelfish do very poorly when they're spread out too thin. And the reason they do poorly is because they become hyper aggressive. And what happens is the dominant angelfish in the tank ends up killing, all the other males, and, it could even be a female that kills them all. And then, one pair ends up being in the tank. So when I'm like in my hatchery, I have a bunch of 30-gallon and 40-gallon breeders that are wide tanks, shallow tanks. And angelfish do not need deep tanks. I've raised perfect angelfish to adult size in 6-inch vats. And most people say, oh, you can't do that. They'll stunt. There'll be curved fins. None of that happens. If the water is kept changed, pristine water, best no overfeeding, water depth is not the important thing. What they need space to get away from each other, and a lot of hiding places. But what I find out is that as my tanks become thinned out, as I pair fish up and remove them from a tank and there's fewer fish in that tank, I have more problems. They start becoming more aggressive, and then pretty soon, if my tanks are too thin, I got dead fish all the time because they're killing each other. If you keep angelfish at a certain density, like if you have let's say a 55-gallon tank and you've got 5 angelfish in there, you're going to have some aggression. It's almost always going to happen. Even though each fish only has 10, 11 gallons per fish, and some people are recommending way more than that, the thinner they get spread out, the more aggressive they become in defending their territory. Once you get that population density to a certain point, they instinctively realize they cannot defend a territory. They cannot spawn because other fish will just, overcome them and eat it. They can't defend it. And so they don't try, and they lose their aggression. I've had tanks which I had very good aeration and good filtration, where I did, 80% water changes every single day. And I could take a 55-gallon tank and I could put 50 adult angelfish in there and keep them in pristine condition, perfect condition, without any trouble at all, because they would not fight at that density. They would not fight in the slightest. And so what most people don't understand is higher densities create less aggression. And if you keep the water cooler, like I recommend, 75, the water has more oxygen, the fish do way better, they need less space, they have less aggression. Now you crowd them, they have even less aggression. You just have to take really good care. When you do the things I'm now mentioning, you have to have the utmost regiment of maintenance, or you're not going to have good fish. They'll get sick, they'll get diseased. But if you're changing a lot of water frequently, if you're not overfeeding, and you're doing, you have good filtration, good aeration, you're going to be successful with those fish. You just have to be willing to do the work. If you're not willing to do the work, then spread them out, put lots of plants and lots of driftwood and lots of hiding places, and hope they don't get, hope they have enough places to get away so they don't kill each other. In a hatchery situation like mine, where I can't have too much stuff in every tank, or I can never catch a fish out of it, you can't avoid the aggression unless you just keep them at a density where the aggression is lower. And most people who are beginners do not understand that. They give advice on the internet all the time, and they give the exact wrong advice. It's the exact opposite of what works. And so that's the thing I think most people would be better off knowing when they get into angelfish is, how do you keep them from being so aggressive? It's high densities, cool water, and lots of hiding places.
Clark?
Yeah. So Steve, let's say I'm listening to your talk, and I'm somebody who's been keeping my angels at 80 degrees and 84 degrees, and they've been sparsely distributed. And I think, oh my gosh, this is a revelation. Now I'm going to increase the density. I'm going to lower the temperature. I'm going to keep the conditions as pristine as possible. Kind of the wild card that I would be trying to figure out is, how do I figure out how much food is the right amount of food? So maybe you could just talk about that transition.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because people ask me all the time, how much do you feed? And I tell people that, you've got to be very observant when you feed your fish. Whatever you do to your tanks, you have to be observant. If you just throw the food in there and it floats to the bottom and it sits there, and you come back a couple hours later and it looks like it's all gone, well, that doesn't mean you did it right. That just means that maybe it rotted within a couple hours because your temperature is so high and there's so much bacteria in the tank that it just eventually gets rotted away. You have to watch your fish eat. Angelfish should always be aggressive feeders. And if you feed them until they quit eating, they are overfed. That's the way it is. They have to still have room to eat. It's like, there's no animal I can think of that you can feed it every day, 2 or 3 times a day, as much as it possibly can eat without causing a health problem. And it's very true on angelfish. So if you have lower temperatures and you were feeding a certain amount of food at 80 degrees and they were doing okay, and now you take it down to 74 or something like that, you're going to have to put less food in and observe very carefully. Did they eat it? How quickly? Was there any left? Did any of it make it to the bottom? Did it stay on the bottom? I mean, I want fish that are eating very quickly and in very short time frames, like a minute. Like the 5-minute rule, I don't think is a good rule. I think it's a rule that causes people to overfeed fish. Fish eat very rapidly when they're hungry and very slowly when they're not. And when they're not hungry and they're eating slow, they don't need food. That's just overfeeding. They should be going after it. I mean, I literally get wet when I'm feeding because they're splashing me. And so I have fish jump out of the tank while I'm feeding. They're going after it so hard. So if you're feeding in the point where they're just eyeing it and slowly picking it, something is either that fish has a sickness, it's got a parasite, or it's not hungry. And so observation will teach you how much food to give a tank at whatever temperature you're keeping them at. And I always say, if you're going to err on the side of feeding way too little and try an extra feeding or 2 each day if you're worried about it. But if they aren't just as vigorously eating at each feeding, that means, well, you got to cut a feeding, or you got to cut the amount at each feeding. So, you really can't learn by me saying count out 6 flakes for each fish at this age, because what they eat depends on temperature, age, size of the flake, their activity, even the water that they're in. pH of 6.3 is going to be different from a pH of 8.3 as far as how the metabolism of that fish works and how it produces egg. Like a female produces a lot of eggs in certain conditions and not in others. And when she's producing eggs, she needs more food. So And if she's producing eggs a lot, she needs a lot more food. But me, since I'm looking for a spawn once every 4, 5, 6 weeks, because I don't want spawns constantly off my fish, I've got them at lower temperatures. They're eating way less food. Maintenance is way easier, because at high temperatures with heavy food loads, you have to change a lot more water if you want the best fish. If you really want the best fish in the world, it's way more work that way. So that's why I do it the way I do it. I find it works better for a breeding operation, and I can't really think of a situation where you would want 83-degree water with heavily fed fish, other than possibly, on some kind of a wholesale situation where you're just cranking numbers out like crazy and you don't have enough space to put more tanks in somewhere else. That's about the only thing I could think of that would justify doing fish at hot temperatures with lots of food.
So Steve, following up on that, one of the questions that came in while you were talking about food was, can you talk about your feeding regimen for raising fry as well? So amounts, frequency, etc.
Well, fry is one of those things where I think everybody should start them out on baby brine shrimp, newly hatched baby brine shrimp. And how I do it is that when I have a spawn, it's wiggling and it starts to free swim. When everything comes up in a cloud and it's swimming around like a normal little angelfish up off the bottom in a group, I don't feed them then. I feed them 24 hours later. They still have a yolk sac, and that yolk sac is not consumed for about 24 hours, maybe even a little longer. And if you feed them before that, if they eat, it'll be very little, like 1 or 2 or 3 little pieces of shrimp. And you're basically just polluting the tank. And so you end up with fish that end up dying because you've fed them when you shouldn't have. So you give them that newly hatched. And when I say newly hatched, you set up a container, at 80 degrees, and 24 hours later, you're siphoning it down to get the shrimp out of it, and you're feeding all of it. If you let it set in a container and feed more later that day, well, that shrimp is using up its own nutrition to grow a shell, and I don't think that does the fish any good. I would rather have them eating that yolk that's in that Artemia and getting the most nutrition possible. So if I'm feeding twice a day, I've got 2 containers that are set 12 hours apart. So each container gets fed every 12 hours, and I feed it all, and then I start it over for the next day. And since I have a lot of tanks and a lot of fish, I don't have to worry about having extra shrimp. If I have extra shrimp, I just throw it in with some bigger fish, and bigger fish eat it right down. I only feed it for about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. And at that point, I wean them onto a dry food. And I do that by giving them maybe a crushed flake, very tiny micro pellet. And I just give them a very tiny amount when they haven't eaten anything else for about, 10, 12 hours. And I try to give them only a bite or two. And as time goes on, a day or two of that, they get hungrier, they try it, they get to the point where they want it, and they start eating that more vigorously. Some people mix the two. They'll mix Artemia and a dry food. When I find when I do that, they eat the Artemia and they just leave the dry food. Eventually, as they grow bigger, they'll start eating dry food, but I get them eating the dry food way quicker if I just keep them from having Artemia at all. They get hungry, they try it, they end up starting to eat it within a day or so. They're eating it, really, really well. And then I take them off the Artemia because Artemia is expensive. And then I put them on, and then as they get a little bit bigger, maybe at about 5 or 6 weeks, I start feeding the frozen brine shrimp. I don't wait for them to get, really old to feed them that, because it's very, very soft, easily torn apart food, and they tear it apart. But that's just, once again, added in at a certain stage, because I wanted to have that high quality food that I believe that frozen shrimp is. And then they still continue to get the dry foods that are appropriate sized for their mouth at whatever age they're at. But the Artemia itself is just a 3-week thing, started 24 hours after they free swim. And I only feed them twice a day. I have people all over the place saying, I feed mine 6 times a day or 8 times a day. If you ever looked at a angelfish fry, it's about 70% belly, the rest of it's fish. Well, I mean, it'd be like a person eating 75 pounds of food. I mean, how many meals a day do you eat if you've eaten, you know, half your body weight in food? Not very many, I would suppose. And it's the way I treat my fish. For the first 2 or 3 days, I feed them once a day, and that's it. After about 4 or 5 days, they're up to twice a day. And I leave them at twice a day for 3 weeks, and then I get them onto to the dry foods. And I typically only feed twice a day on dry foods, although on a rare occasion I might go 3 times a day, but not very often. And it's because my tank temperature is at 75, 76, 77 degrees. Twice a day is more than enough. They'll grow perfectly fine on twice a day at that temperature. So I'm not trying to speed grow them, you know, because if you speed grow fish, angelfish, it's very tough to get straight, perfect finnage, great color, you know, because it creates high bacteria levels in the tank, and that bacteria is stressful to the fish. So I'm growing them slowly, relatively slowly, on relatively small feedings where I don't overfeed, so there's no stress level, so their finnage is the best and their color is the best. And that's what's worked for me to get the quality that I get. I see too many people overfeeding their fish, and their fish end up with poor color, terrible fins, short, chopped. You know, when you see a chopped off dorsal fin on angelfish, that's not from ammonia. Ammonia does not burn fins. That's from bacteria. That's heterotrophic bacteria that's actually chewing the fish away. It's eating the fish. And that's what'll kill the fish. And if it doesn't kill it, it'll deform its fins so they grow up crooked, bent, ugly, nasty looking things. Typically what you see in a pet shop. And that's what I'm trying to avoid. And anybody who's trying to raise high quality fish, that's not the formula.
Okay, Steve, we're going to take just a short break here. We like to do a survey, and then we're going to give our, you know, some people like to go into a separate breakout room for, you know, some other fish related discussion. Other people will stay here for some more specific questions and answers. So we want to thank you very much for your talk so far, and we're looking forward to some additional Q&A. But Randy, would you like to put up the survey for us?
Certainly.
Stay, Steve. Stay, okay? Don't go.
Okay.
Yeah, don't go anywhere, Steve.
Yeah, okay, the survey is already posted now. You're seeing it, correct? Just want to get some feedback.
Yes, yes.
Good. The first one is about topic. You know, what did you think of the topic? And the second one is about the presenter. And we have not only numbers, but a few little phrases with it to kind of help you understand, you know, where to grade your numbers. So just go ahead and quickly select that. Shouldn't take you too long. Let's everybody try to quickly come up with an answer so we can roll on to the next part of the agenda.
Randy, I don't see this. Is that because
We're co-host.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good. As long
Okay.
as I know why.
Just 3 or 4 of us don't see it. So our votes don't count.
But I could make some joke about our ability to rig the election, but I don't think I will.
Oh, we could, but
Just while people are doing the survey, there's a thank you in the chat, Steve, for the information that you shared, and the idea that could also be applied to other species. So that was good.
while I'm leaving the poll up for a minute longer, just want to say we have the breakout room, and the breakout room, if you want to stay around and listen to some more question and answers, that's fine. Just when you're done, you can still choose the breakout room, and we always tend to go till like 10 o'clock or a little later, which is an hour and a half from now. So this runs rather long, and it's basically a chance for different people to get a chance to go around the circle. And if somebody wants to share a little bit about what's going on in their fish room, or we just get to know each other a bit better. People ask questions, kind of open-ended forum, and it's moderated. So consider that for the breakout room, and just go to the breakout room when you're there. Otherwise, stay here for the Q&A. Most people have voted, so we usually don't show this, so I'm just going to end the poll. And there it is, it's done.
And so Steve is on East Coast time, so it's 9:30. Okay, we're not gonna go an hour and a half with Steve.
You aren't.
Right. We're probably gonna.
That's past my bedtime.
Yeah. We'll go probably another 20 minutes, or we'll end it up if there are no questions. But we will have a hard stop within 20 minutes. Okay.
So as I said, you can join the fish room breakout room right now, or as the everything winds down in the Q&A here, if you'd like to go ahead and join us, go ahead and join at that time. So that's it.
And for those of you who are wondering, how do you join the breakout room? You go to the menu bar across the bottom, and there should be a button called breakout rooms, and you'd be able to move yourself there. If you can't move yourself there, put it in the chat where you want to go, and Kurt will move you. So
There's only one breakout room. Is what we've been having lately.
Yeah.
So, okay.
yeah, well, if somebody,
We
anyway.
used to have multiple ones to choose from. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to just answer this question to William. William, thanks for joining us. And yes, this is our general membership meeting for the Minnesota Aquarium Society, and we always try to have a speaker. And Steve Rybicki is our speaker this month. We aren't having a general membership meeting in July because that's our summer break, but then we'll be starting back up in August. So stay tuned to aquarium.mn for future announcements and topics. We've got a couple people in the chat. Kurt,
Yeah, I already sent him.
thank you very much.
I told him where to go.
Yeah, here we are. This is where we're not so friendly anymore. No, I'm kidding. Steve, I wanted to ask, when you were talking about you want to see your fish furiously feeding, and I'm assuming there's not much food that hits the bottom, but let's go back to kind of that general. You're saying you're doing 80% water changes. Does that, I assume that's automated with 500 tanks, but are you also, vacuuming out the bottom of the tanks? And how, do you use sponge filters in the corner? Do you have some other filtration system? Maybe you could just talk a little bit for somebody who might want to take, and manage 2 or 3 or 10 tanks. That might give them a little insight.
Sure. Actually, I have the most antiquated system in the world. I use hoses to fill the tank and siphons to empty them. There's nothing automated. I don't do all of them myself, so I do a lot of them though. And I have a very large diameter hose. I'm talking, I can drain a 30-gallon tank in 20 seconds. I mean, I'm not sitting there with a little airline trying to get stuff off the bottom of the tank. I'm siphoning it down very fast. I have a little contraption I put over the end of the siphon that keeps things from getting sucked in, because I'll suck in fish, snails, you name it. I mean, flower pots, I mean, it's going. And I have a hose that I'm filling them with, and it's got a little nozzle I made on the end that causes it to go in as a spray, because I want aerated water going into the tank. So about as fast as I can siphon, I siphon a little faster than I can fill, but the water's going in full bore out of a hose as fast as it can go, with a very good pressure pump on it. So I'm probably filling that 30-gallon tank from an 80% drawdown. I'm probably filling it in less than a minute. So it's very, 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 very fast, and I want the water going in very frothy so that gas exchange occurs almost instantly. And I have a well, so I don't have to dechlorinate it. But if I did, I would just use dechlorinator. I wouldn't use an ammonia remover or any of them. I think those products are not good products for fish rooms. Things like Prime, I sell active filters to people that are established, and whenever anybody has a problem, it's almost one of 2 things every single time, and it's either that they're using Prime, which I think is binding the ammonia that the filter needs to survive, or they're doing something else that's, causing that ammonia to just not, like some people, instead of using fish to create ammonia, they use ammonia out of a bottle. And I don't think that works all the time. And I don't know why. It may be because you can't put too much in at one time or whatever. But those are the two reasons it fails. And so I don't recommend you use any kind of an ammonia neutralizer, just a chlorine remover if you have it. If you're lucky enough to be on a well like me, then you don't have to do anything except aerate the water. So my tanks have sponge filters in them. It's the only filter I own. I don't own another filter of any kind. And I produce some of the nicest fish in the world with nothing more than a sponge filter. And I'm not talking about a great big giant one or 10 of them in a tank. There might be 2 of them in a tank. And it might be a tank that has 15 adult angelfish in it or 20 adult angelfish. And they're more than adequate to, the limiting factor with angelfish is not filtration. That if you are failing at angelfish, if it's from filtration, I would be shocked. I would be absolutely shocked. 99.9% of the time, you will fail because of diseases, parasites, bacteria, or overfeeding or underwater changing. That's the only thing you have to concentrate on, in my opinion, is diseases that you bring in, overfeeding, and underwater changing. If you do one of those wrong, you will have trouble. You'll have trouble with color, you'll have trouble with fins, you'll have trouble with bloating, you'll have trouble with something. But filtration, I have never had a problem with filtration in 55 years and using the most minimal filtration you can imagine on a tank. It's simply not important. Not in my opinion. A lot of people would think I'm crazy for saying that, but that's just my experience. I raise unbelievably nice fish if I do the other things and ignore filtration. If I put 15 filters in the tank and don't change water, overfeed, they'll all be dead in a week. That it won't matter. Filters don't remove problems. All they do is store them in their filter, and if the water in the tank is still passing through it. It just doesn't solve the issue. And ammonia and nitrites are not an issue in 99% of aquariums from people who are past the very basic raw beginner stage. Once you have an established filter, you got to really screw up to unestablish it. You got to do things wrong, and they got to be really wrong. So I think that you just concentrate on those, the feeding, the water changes, the amount of fish in the tank, the temperature of the tank. Those types of things are far more important than what kind of filtration you've got. And when you have a lot of tanks, I want the cheapest filter I can put in that tank. So there, I have a big blower in the room that's running, 400 filters, with very minimal electricity, and it's taking care of, I have plants, I have snails, I have other things in the tanks, but it's taking care of any problems that may occur on occasion from excess feeding or whatever. The ammonia is not the issue. It's always a bacterial thing or something to that effect.
You talked about breeding wild type fish and crossing back to wild type fish. A couple people though have asked if you've made an effort to try to breed Ultums or try to breed Leopoldis. And when I was thinking about your efforts to, try to open up market sections, do things that other people can't do, I'm wondering if you've ever looked at breeding those types of angels.
Oh yeah, sure. Ultums. I'm an ornamental fish breeder. I care about creating what attracted me since I was a little kid was ornamental varieties that people manipulated to look a certain way. Ultums are gorgeous fish, but I have no purpose for raising an Ultum just to raise Ultums. I've had them. I had them solely for the purpose of trying to cross them to domestic fish. I had them spawn. I even had them spawn in 8.5 pH water that was 300 parts per million hardness. They would eat the spawns right away. I didn't care. That's not what my goal was. my goal was to spawn them with domestics. In fact, Dave Lasnik, the guy I've mentioned a couple times now, he had Altums that he had with some wild cross Scalari. They were out of the Nene fish crossed to a koi. And he actually had a male Altum spawn with the female Scalari multiple times, maybe 20 times. And I personally witnessed the spawns, and he had fertile eggs. But what would happen is they would die when they hatched, and he ended up with 6 wigglers that almost, out of many, many spawns, 6 wigglers almost made it to free swimming before they died, and they died also. But he did get them to spawn, and there were living fry hatched from them. And so it may be possible, but we couldn't do it. And when we finally came to the conclusion that that was not going to work for us, at least at our current level of knowledge of doing this, we got rid of them. No use for them whatsoever, unless I can cross it to if I could get an Altum that looked like a koi, I'm all in. But if it's just going to look like an Altum, I don't care. I don't care anything about it. It means nothing to me. I'm an ornamental fish breeder. That's why that's the sole reason that I do this. And when it came to Leopoldi, which once again I got because I thought, well, I don't know what they'll look like, but I'm going to try to cross these into them. And I couldn't stand them because it was like watching a tank of African cichlids. I brought them in twice. I thought, well, maybe this first batch was just crazy. But what happens is they don't stop picking on each other. And I mean, they don't stop ever picking on each other. They were constantly 24/7 beating on each other. They didn't really hurt each other, but it was like watching crazy fish going after each other constantly. And I thought, I don't even like these things. I don't want them in my tanks. I like peaceful angelfish. I have ideal water for African cichlids. So if I wanted fish beating on each other all the time, I just go get some African cichlids, but and they have all kinds of color. But the Leopoldi just I didn't like the long bodied fish. The color was nothing spectacular. I didn't like the large scales. They had larger than normal scales that a Scalari does not have. And their aggressive pecking order, or whatever you might want to call it, drove me crazy. So I didn't like them. So I got rid of them. So the only thing that I've really been satisfied with so far that would breed would be wild type Scalari, which there are many variants of that look quite unique. And whenever I have an opportunity to get one of those variants, I'll bring it in and see what I can do with it. But in the United States, we don't get a lot of those really good variants. Most of them go to Europe or Southeast Asia, and they get the best. So we get the leftovers or whatever's not as common. And so I don't care as much about them either as far as their native color, because I'm always looking to cross them into domestic stock. And so my goals are just a little different than what the average aquarist goals probably would be. A lot of people just love to breed Altums. They're gorgeous fish. They would think that this is great. And a lot of people do. And they do successfully breed them, but it just wasn't something that turned me on. So I didn't pursue it past not being able to cross them into the domestics.
Fair enough. Thanks. This is just a joke, but I could say that maybe the Leopoldis were just kind of ticked off that they were in cooler water and they weren't getting fed as much as they wanted. So they were picking on each other, but let's move on.
Maybe it was, but the funny thing is I have a quarantine room and I don't let, nothing comes into my hatchery in fact, nothing comes into my hatchery. I never did explain this. My hatchery is quarantined. My hatchery is quarantined to the point where the only thing that's ever gone into it are eggs from fish. So a fish has never been brought into my hatchery. My hatchery produces fish and they leave, but none ever go in. So like if I brought in Leopoldi and I wanted to introduce it to my hatchery, they go into a quarantine room. It's in another building. It's nowhere near any of my fish. They spawn there. I remove the eggs. I clean them. I hatch them. I take them to the hatchery. That's how I introduce new fish. they never spawned in my quarantine room. And part of it was I didn't give them the chance because I couldn't stand them. I didn't like them. I didn't want to cross them into my fish. So I got rid of them. But let's pretend I brought in a fish I did want to keep, which I have on occasion. I'll bring in wild fish from different places. That fish never goes into my fish room ever. I am paranoid about disease problems. When you've got hundreds of tanks with many tens of thousands of dollars worth of fish in them, you're not going to risk them over a parasite that could be really nasty. At least I'm not going to. So I came up with a system where I spawn them in a different location, remove the eggs, wash the eggs, take them over to the hatchery, hatch them there, and then I've got that fish in that hatchery. That's the only way I get a new fish.
So that was interesting to hear about your quarantine process. Thanks for sharing that. Somebody asked, Dan from Angelfish Haven says hi, and his water quality changed about 3 years ago, and he's struggling to get angelfish fry to survive past the first feeding. He's tried temps, even RO water, and nothing seems to work. Maybe you could just talk a little bit in a broader sense about getting past that challenge of getting fry past the first feeding and getting them rolling. Because once you get them rolling, they seem to do quite well.
Yeah, it's a common problem. And the reason being is water is a universal solvent and everything under the sun can dissolve into it. And so everybody's water is different. And some water is so good, so suitable for angelfish that a person could do it blindfolded and always get vigorous fry that swim and eat like crazy. And other people, their water is so bad that it takes mental gymnastics and all kinds of manipulation to get anything to live because they're fighting uphill, they're swimming upstream. The battle is one where they're dealing with unknown factors of things in that water that are creating either bacterial problems or direct toxins for the fish. And a lot of times I had a water source at one time that was so bad I gave up on it. I closed the room down and left. Could not raise fish in that location. Could not. And yet I had at the same time another location where I could raise everything without even trying. So it wasn't technique. It was water. And if you are in a situation where you have the worst water in the world, then you're going to struggle. There might be an answer. You might be able to change enough water, condition the water with hydrogen peroxide or some kind of a antibiotic or something to help bacteria levels. Usually when they die when they're really young, it's from bacteria. If it's not bacteria, it's from a toxin, something dissolved in the water. Figuring that out is not easy, and figuring out what will work is not easy, but you can experiment to the point where you may figure it out. You may find out you have to do water changes on it every day of 95% twice a day, something like that. You might have to do that plus antibiotic. You got to make there's so many possibilities as to what it could be and what the solution could be. All I can say is that if you've got great water, you're going to think, everybody's crazy. There's nothing easier than doing angelfish. And if you've got bad water, you're going to think these are the toughest things on the planet that there is to spawn and keep alive. And it's all perspective. It's all a matter of whether you're lucky enough to have great water or you're unlucky enough to have the worst stuff that angelfish would want. And you'll get all kinds of experiences on that. And if you experiment enough, you might figure out a way. I've had locations where water was really pretty bad, and I did raise fish in those locations, but I found out I had to do things a certain way. And so the only way you're ever going to find out is with a lot of experimentation. And what I would do is when a pair was spawning, I would pull the slate mid-spawn, put another slate in. They'd keep spawning. I'd pull that one, put another one in. They'd keep spawning. Now I've got 3 slates of eggs. I'd put them in 3 jars, and I'd try 3 different, radically different techniques to hatch them and raise them to see what would work. And I did that constantly because it gave me triple the number of spawns to experiment with. And since I would get 8 or 10 or 15 spawns a day anyway, I could set up 30 jars, experiment wildly with each jar and see if one of them worked. And then within, you know, a few weeks, usually I could figure out, okay, if I do this, they live. And so depending on how many spawns you're getting, if you're not getting very many, you can try removing the spawning surface mid-spawn, putting another one in there, and they'll just keep spawning. They don't know you took it out. You know, they'll be confused for a couple seconds, but they'll just go right back to spawning. I do it all the time.
Well, Steve, and just a note to our audience, we are going to stop at the on the hour because it's already 10 o'clock for Steve. And unfortunately, we're getting a lot of questions, but we're not going to be able to get to all of them. So, Steve, I think one of the follow-up question was when you said you were talking about the Leopoldii interspecific cross, and you said you wash the eggs. And one of the questions, how do you wash eggs? So you sterilize the eggs in some way?
Well, it's really with eggs, they're adhesive. They stick to a slate. I can take that slate out and just run it underwater. And that's all I have to do is just, I rub the back of the slate with my hand, but I basically for about 60 seconds run it under running water of, the right temperature.
All right, good. So I think, so I know where I get my angelfish from, Steve. So, but a lot of people cannot, okay? They get their angelfish from either fellow fish keepers or fish stores. So as a general question, what should these people look for when they're trying to buy angelfish?
Well, pet shops are a tough place to buy them. I mean, you really should try to find a local breeder if you can, because they're likely to have at least a little bit healthier stock, although most local breeders are still going to have parasites because you just can't avoid it without unbelievably strict quarantine procedures. It's just that their fish are so well cared for, they can live with a parasite load and still do fine. So the problem with shops is that they can have some really nasty stuff. They could have viruses or some parasites that are just so nasty it's just almost impossible to kill them. But if you find a good shop that has a good local breeder providing their fish, you might be able to get something pretty decent from them. But that's what I would look for. I would say, I'd ask the shop owner, hey, where are you getting your angelfish? Are you importing them or are they coming from a local breeder? And if they're coming from a local breeder, they should look better. They should be a little healthier, and hopefully they're moving them in and out fast enough that, if there were problems, the shop wouldn't keep getting them. Hopefully that's what would happen. It's a gamble. And sometimes when you bring them in, it's always best to, if you can have an extra quarantine tank set up, just so you can put them in there for 2 or 3 weeks and watch them and see if they're going to get really sick. Because I can't tell you how many people tell me they bought an angelfish, brought it back, they had already had 6 or 7 tanks, and then all of a sudden every tank is sick because they didn't quarantine. And so if you can quarantine even for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and another tank, you can avoid some of the more serious problems, or at least keep it isolated to that newly brought in fish. And don't touch the water in one tank and then, from that quarantine tank and go to another tank, because you'll spread, just takes a drop of water to spread whatever nasty thing you've got. You just want to make sure you feed it, at the end of the day or after you've already messed with every other tank you have, and water change it at the end of the day when you've already messed with every tank you've had, and do everything you can to avoid cross-contamination between good tanks and bad tanks or quarantine tanks. But that I really highly recommend, quarantining fish so that if you bring in a problem, you isolate it. But when it comes to just looking at fish in a tank, you want fins that are spread, fish that are alert, swimming nicely, pointed fins if possible, no sharp bends or kinks and stuff like that. I mean, look at pictures of really nice angelfish and try to find that kind of fish in your shop. Most shops have an awful selection of, very short finned, crooked finned, stunted fish of many different sizes. And you kind of want them all, if they're from the same spawn, to be all similar size. That means it's a good sign they were cared for properly.
All right, terrific. We have a lot of questions, Steve, but we're going to cut it off. I think it just shows you that those are a huge amount of information. I thought I knew a lot about angelfish, and I've been taking notes like crazy. So thank you very much. Really, thank you very much. We've been getting lots of accolades in the chat as well. I'm going to put onto the chat for everybody who's still here the link to all of your articles. Again, extraordinarily well-written articles, so clear, very clear. This is what you do. No rambling, right to the point. So, Steve, thank you so much for your and thank you really for your support of Minnesota Aquarium Society and of this great aquarium fish, the angels.
It was my pleasure, Willie, and it was really thank you guys for having me on. I enjoy doing it for you. So, and I'm sure we'll be talking down the road.
Right, terrific.
Good. Thanks so much.